Goeiedag! Good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world.
I've been looking around for salvation. I've been looking around for the truth. All around me I see frustration, and I looked all over till I found you. I sit and listen to your stories, and you're telling me, please don't worry. There's a lot in this world you should know, and love in life is where you should go. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then love in life will guide you. I know that life outside is so hard. There's a lot of things that can tear you apart. I know the roads sometimes feel lonely, but remember you're not the one and only. There's always someone there to help you, a helping hand to pull you through. There's only one thing you should do: take my hand and join the Love and Laugh crew. If you're looking for somewhere to go, if you're looking for someone to know, if you're looking for someone to guide you, then they love and life guide you.
Goeienaand! Good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And tonight we've got a very interesting person joining us. It's Dan Roodt. Dan is seen by some as a controversial character because of his fight to protect the culture of the Afrikaner. He is a prolific writer, and because of his views is labeled by some people as a racist. Tonight we're going to be discussing a range of topics, including the role of NGOs in South Africa. Right, now, Dan also has an organization called Praag, which stands for Pro-Afrikaans Aksiegroep, or Pro-Afrikaans Action Group. Right, I'm going to get Dan on line so we can get into the chat. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Is your camera on?
Keep my mic. Yeah, it should be on.
I can just see the little icon at the moment.
Oh, okay. Well, let me see. Okay, let me just click on the camera here. Can you see me now?
Not yeah. No, I can. Yeah, there you are. Perfect.
Okay. Okay,
Perfect. Perfect.
and you, yeah, I can't see you on the other
Oh no,
hand.
you won't see me because of my streaming software grabs my camera, so you,
Oh, okay,
you
fine.
just have to put
Okay.
up with the voice only. Now,
Okay.
Dan, you've got an
Yes.
organization called Praag. Tell us about
Yes,
Praag,
that's
just
right.
as a kickoff.
Well, Prague was founded in 2000 when it became obvious to us that, the ANC was going to drive their agenda and they're going to essentially suppress our local culture, particularly the Afrikaans language and culture. And we thought that we wanted to oppose that, and that's why we founded Praag as the Pro-Afrikaans Action Group. But it soon became obvious that, the entire campaign from the ANC and the government and all these left-wing organizations was directed at Western people in South Africa as such, all of us. It was, and so it became a slightly broader movement with slightly broader objectives, but essentially, we're fighting a kind of an information war, or propaganda war, which South Africa lost in the 1980s, and we haven't recovered from it. And a lot of people don't seem to understand that information today, especially, but even in the past, is the most important field of conflict of all, because ultimately, it's like Sun Tzu or somebody said, the best form of victory is when you can simply overwhelm your opponent without actually using any violence at all. Now, the ANC did use a lot of violence against South Africa, but towards the end there, it was almost as if they just walked in and took over without any resistance from the old government or from us, and essentially that was due to the fact that they waged such a successful propaganda war against South Africa for decades, and it's still going on.
Right. Now, we're basically talking about freedom of speech here. I mean, people with different
Yes.
perspectives, which is a very healthy type of state to have. It means
Yes.
people can actually share their views, discuss them. You don't have to like them, but at least you can hear them if you want to. What's happening now in South Africa is rather like what happened in the 1980s. I think you had an article or a book banned back then in the 1980s by the National
Yes,
Party government.
yeah, yes. We had a little magazine around 1980 with a few contributors, and then the thing got banned, and eventually it was even banned for possession. But it was fairly innocuous by today's standards.
Right.
So, but it was more of a kind of a student prank more than anything else. It wasn't all that serious. But today, of course, supposedly we've got freedom of speech and so on, but again, there's a form of censorship at work in South Africa, and especially self-censorship. People are very scared to say certain things or to, criticize certain aspects of South African society, because then you will either fall foul of the law or something, and they are preparing these new hate speech laws. So, eventually if you criticize the ANC ministers, they might say it's hate speech, and they'll put you away for that.
Well, we do have an example of that, which has just happened. A lady down in Durban, she referred to Ramaphosa as an ape trying to be a president, and she put that up on the Facebook page, and that immediately caused a furor. and she took it down, and she's now actually facing criminal injuria charges for that.
Exactly.
Now,
That's exactly the kind of thing that they're doing. Whereas they can say what they like about us, they can call us Nazis and racists and settlers and colonialists and people who don't belong in the country, and they can even call for the kill the boer, kill the farmer, and that kind of thing, and that's all permissible. Because the whole court case around Malema, when he sang "Kill a Boer, Kill a Farmer," that turned out to be a damp squib, and in the end he also got away with it, and he's still singing that song, just by changing
the
spelling.
The South African Human Rights Commission referred to him using creative speech, and it was on that basis that they actually found him not guilty of hate speech, which I find quite incredible. But
Yes,
just like so many other institutions, it's just a total set of double standards that just applies all the way through. Now, just
Exactly.
continuing with censorship, the government has basically banned people from saying anything about COVID-19 unless it
Yes.
comes directly from the government. That is a form of censorship. And if you do say something like that guy in Cape Town who suggested that some of the swabs might be infected with COVID-19, he's now facing court and 6 months behind bars. Now, I get a lot of emails from people, and Marlena, who's helps me a lot in organizing the live streams. You've chatted to Marlena. We're
Yes.
trying to organize people who've got businesses who have been impacted by the lockdown to come out and talk to us. And we've had a couple who said, "I would love to talk to you, but I'm really worried about how that will impact me personally if I come out and talk about what's happening to me," which is exactly what the ANC government want, is to stifle that sort of discussion. What are your views on that?
Yes, I think they want to, mitigate any form of criticism of their actions, and also the corruption that they are involved in. But there's no real democratic debate in South Africa at all. It's just a repetition of tired left-wing slogans, and that's precisely why we're in such a predicament, because people are not thinking properly about the situation, and everybody just accepts all these slogans and cliches and shibboleths from the past. Whereas if we are going to succeed as a country, we're going to have to think creatively and think innovatively, because it's a fairly unique situation that we find ourselves in, and we're going to have to start thinking outside the box. Whereas now we just saddled with this old kind of left-wing Marxist thinking and ideology. I mean, we're now such good friends with Cuba, and Cuba is sending us 217 medical officers, including doctors and nurses and so on. What for? I mean, haven't we got our own doctors and nurses? But why do we? And then they're even spending millions, hundreds of millions, in sending students from here to Cuba to study medicine there, in Spanish, I suppose. I mean, how many people in South Africa, especially black people, speak Spanish?
Right.
I mean, you must be able to count them on one hand, on the fingers of one hand.
Dan, I have to.
And therefore,
I have to say that just about a week ago, I had a doctor who came on.
yes,
And she couldn't get into a medical school in South Africa because of the color of her skin. And because of affirmative
Yes.
action, something like 95% of all admissions at medical school are black. And it's got nothing
Exactly.
to do with the actual standard of their matric. In fact, someone with B's can get in because they're black, but a white person with straight A's is rejected because of the color of their skin. And what's happening to these doctors now is that they're actually going overseas to actually become doctors. They study overseas. And now the
Yes.
HPCSA, which is the Health Practitioners Council of South Africa, has made it impossible when they come back from overseas to South Africa to actually practice as a doctor. And there's something like
Really?
there's something like 400 of them like that. They're stuck. They can't practice. They've spent 6 years studying. They've got their qualified doctors, and yet, you talk about the black doctors. They're shipped to Cuba, where they get trained for the first 5 years, all paid for by the government. They come back to South
Yes,
Africa, and then they do their internship here in South Africa, bang, and they're straight qualified doctors. Whereas this group who cannot get into medical school and study overseas, when they come back to South Africa, they're prevented from being doctors. No wonder we have such a brain drain in this country.
Yes, and it's so unfair.
It is.
And it's denying those skills to the country because there's an actual shortage of doctors in South Africa.
Absolutely, there is. Now, I want to take you back a bit in time, because, like myself, you're a bit of an old fart. We're both old. Now, pre-1994,
Yes.
you sort of grew up during that period, and then after 1994, tell me how things have changed for you in South Africa after the ANC came into power.
Well, I think for me personally, increasingly I found myself at loggerheads with the system from about the late 90s, I would say, even from about 1996, because then it became clear to me what direction it was going to move into. But then people were still prepared to listen to you, and I could write articles in the newspapers, and up to the early 2000s, you didn't have this kind of groupthink and this clampdown that we've got now. But soon after that, I wrote one article about a family, including a 1-year-old child, a baby, 1 year old, and they were completely massacred in Pretoria. In fact, it was the baby's birthday.
Wow.
And the baby and the mother and the grandmother, they were all killed.
That's awful.
And then I wrote quite a strongly worded article about that, and they didn't want to publish that, and then they banned me from ever again, even without the thing being published, from ever writing in any of the Naspers newspapers after that. So, after that, the ANC started in indirect ways controlling the media in South Africa, and there's this fear of criticizing them. And I mean, people write about the corruption and so on, but I think it's all part of the factionalism within the ANC, but there's no real constructive criticism and pointing the way towards solutions for the country's problems, because everybody just, all the media and the academics, they all seem to be married to this idea that the ANC will rule until Jesus comes, as Jacob Zuma once put it.
Right. Now, post-1994, with the ANC, South Africa has, just degraded into nothingness, really. And clearly, a very big part of that is black economic empowerment and incompetence, because what you've now got is people who are not qualified, who are now taking on senior roles and just destroying what used to be fantastic businesses or state-owned enterprises.
Yes, exactly.
Now, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I personally knew one of the directors of SAA, way back when I was still a student. And at that time, somebody who was director of SAA lived in a middle-class house, earned a middle-class salary, and maybe could afford to buy the entry-level Merc as a vehicle, as a personal vehicle. So, and that's the reason why SAA and similar state-owned enterprises, as they call them, were successful in those days, because people didn't go into those jobs and into those businesses with the idea of getting rich or, looting the place, as they've done since the ANC came to power. And now, you had people like, you had various directors of SAA who got millions in bonuses and salaries, and they absolutely looted the place within a few years. They also made mistakes. When I worked in banking for a while in...
You were at Nedbank, were you?
Yes, and Standard, and also at Citibank. But I had a friend at Nedbank, and he later on went to work for another smaller bank. And he told me, and they were doing some business with SAA. And he told me once that there was one of these affirmative action appointees who did a financial transaction. It was an interest rate hedging transaction where he made an error, and the error cost the company 5 billion rand. 5 billion.
What?
And it was just swept under the carpet. It never got into the media or anything like that. But can you imagine, they appoint somebody there dealing with these colossal amounts, in a position of responsibility. He makes a mistake, and there are 5 billion down the tubes. So it doesn't surprise me that the place like SAA is now on the verge of going under and being declared bankrupt and so on, after having received 20 or 30 billion rand in bailouts over the last few years. But it's just, it's a combination of incompetence, dishonesty, and of course the government policy of just getting rid of whites, firing all the skilled white people and bringing in their cronies and their cadres, and, people who shouldn't be doing those jobs under any normal circumstances.
Right. Just for the record, we've got about 600 people watching right now. Now,
okay, great.
I want to take you back to when this transition happened in South Africa, because let's face it, South Africa will never be the same again. One of the key things that they set up was the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now,
yes.
I think you know quite a lot about that. What were your views on the role that they played during this period?
Well, I wrote a little book about that because, I bought when it came out, I bought the printed edition of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. It's about 5 or 6 volumes. It's a huge set of books. And, it cost me quite a bit of money at the time as well. But you can find most of it online too, so you don't really need to have the books to be able to read it and look stuff up. But it became clear to me that it was just a complete whitewash of the ANC's terrorism. The two main people running the show were Desmond Tutu and Alex Borain. And then they had a few sidekicks, sitting on the commission. And they exonerated most of these ANC terrorists and people who planted bombs, or even those APLA people who massacred that church congregation down in the Cape at the St. James church massacre, they actually gave them amnesty. I mean, how unbelievable is that?
It's crazy.
That you can go into a church and just mow down people with an automatic weapon, and you get amnesty for that. And if it hadn't been for that one guy he was a police reservist or something, and he had his firearm with him, and he started shooting back, causing the APLA terrorists to run away. If it hadn't been for that, I mean, probably they would have killed all those people. But I can't remember the exact number of people killed, but it was a huge number, like 10 or 20, and many, many injured. And they got amnesty. And then they refused amnesty to most of the policemen who, during the 1980s, when this whole terrorist war against South Africa was at its most intense, and they had orders to try and suppress the thing and counter some of these people who were placing bombs or subverting the system. And I mean, some of them did not always obey the law themselves, but they were in a kind of a covert war situation. But compared to, say, the Americans at Guantanamo Bay or whatever, or the British or anyone else, I mean, I think they handled themselves fairly well, and they didn't go to extremes. But the police were mostly refused amnesty. They had to go through court cases, and they were even still prosecuting policemen who are elderly, 85 or 90 years old, for things that they'd supposedly done in the early 70s. So the whole notion that there was reconciliation and forgiveness and, all of that, it's a complete sham. The ANC and all its hangers on, like Tutu and his commission, they are still out for revenge, and they absolutely want to crush us and the white South Africans, and just ultimately destroy us.
Yeah.
And there's this constant propaganda about apartheid and how evil the white population acted in the past, and a lot of lies and half-truths being spread, and nobody ever looks at the real history and at the facts.
Right.
I've never actually, I've seen, and I've read a lot of books and articles and so on, and I've never seen any quotation from a government minister or one of the academic theorists who wrote policy prior to 1994, and there were books written, and hundreds of books and treatises and PhD theses and so on about South Africa's policies, and especially regarding the multi-ethnic nature of this country, and none of it has ever been quoted by anybody except that one paragraph from Roodt where he talks about Bantu education, but then they leave out half of it in order to actually just smear Roodt, and it's done in such bad faith that you can't really take it seriously.
Well,
so there's a complete falsification of our past.
Yeah.
And it's presented as this kind of that the old government was out to just irrationally commit violence left, right, and center, just shoot people and massacre them and so on. I mean, I even saw something. Yeah, I saw somebody sent me via email a YouTube video of Oliver Tambo, who, of course, was the main, apart from Mandela and Slovo, he was the main terrorist leader of the ANC while they were in exile. But he was living in luxury, being supported by Sweden and the Nordic countries, and he was kind of to and fro.
Tell us about Sweden's role in this whole thing, bringing down South Africa.
Well, you see, Sweden during first of all, there were some people in the 50s who met each other here in Johannesburg, including a Swedish journalist whose name was Per Westberg, and he got friends with some of the left-wing people in Johannesburg. Then he went back to Sweden. But during the 1960s, Sweden was radicalized around the protests against the Vietnam War, the US involvement in Vietnam. And it was shifting left all the time. Then eventually in 1968, Olof Palme, the guy who was assassinated in 1986, I'm actually reading a book about that at the moment. I've actually been at that spot where he was assassinated. There's a brass plaque on the sidewalk where he was shot in 1986. And there's a theory that it could have been South Africans who shot him, in order to stop the Swedish funding of the ANC. But there are so many conspiracy theories around that that you can't say for sure who did it and what the motive was. So I think we can really, and in Sweden, South Africa is not very high on the list of suspects for his assassination anyway. But that aside, under his leadership, while he was Prime Minister of Sweden, they started channeling millions of dollars to the ANC. And they even had gatherings of the Swedish Parliament where the ANC would come and address them. And Oliver Tambo was invited to come and speak to them. And he was treated almost like a visiting statesman or something like that in Sweden in the 70s. And increasingly also in the 1980s. But eventually so they claimed that they never sponsored the violence that the ANC committed in South Africa, that the Soviet Union and East Germany, they were doing that. But because of all the money that they were spreading around, obviously they were also sponsoring them, financing them. And in fact, in 1977, Sweden signed a European treaty against terrorism. And I'm pretty sure that there must be a clause in there that also prohibits the funding of terrorism. But regardless of that treaty and the fact that they committed to it, they kept on funding the ANC. In fact, there was a man, I think his name is Anders Millerman. He was at one point immediately in the early 90s, I think he was also at the Swedish embassy in Pretoria. I'm not sure if he was the ambassador or not, but he worked there. And in 2004, he was on the radio here where he said that without Sweden, the ANC would never have come to power in South Africa. And I think he's right. And lots of even the Swedish academic commentators and so on who have written books about this, they've also said that without the help of Sweden, the ANC would never have come to power in South Africa. And now, we are talking about NGOs the last time we spoke, and a lot of these political NGOs in South Africa are also funded by a body called SIDA, which is the Swedish International Development Aid. And they are still involved here and, funding left-wing NGOs and so on to make sure that their protege stays in power. The reason why Sweden got so heavily involved was because they were at that time, apart from Eastern Europe, of course, which was under the Soviet influence, they were the most left-wing oriented government in the West at that time,
Right.
apart from the Netherlands, which was also pretty leftist, and they also funded the ANC and worked together with them, and even sent people here, sort of underground guerrillas or whatever you would call them, to South Africa to smuggle weapons and handle explosives. And of course, that the Church Street bomb was also transported by a Belgian woman, but she was of Dutch origin. As far as I know, she was born in the Netherlands and she had a Dutch passport as well. And there was another guy, the one who was held up in the Dutch embassy in Pretoria for about 18 months or 2 years, Klaas de Jonge. He was also heavily involved in the whole covert terrorist operation that the ANC and the East Germans and the Soviet Union were running in South Africa. The Soviet Union was also very much involved in the whole thing. They even at times, the ANC at one time asked them whether they didn't want to invade the country, and there was a plan, and they were working on a plan that they would send some ships down the Indian Ocean coast, and that they would land somewhere around Durban or the Natal coast, and then invade South Africa and overthrow the government and install the ANC. But then the Russians kind of looked at the plan again, and they thought there were too many kind of uncertainties there, and that South Africa might have fought back quite passionately. So they decided to shelve that plan and just stuck with this kind of asymmetrical terrorist kind of approach that the ANC had adopted, and that everybody else in Southern Africa had adopted, because it wasn't only South Africa, it was the entire subcontinent, Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, Namibia, or Southwest as it used to be called. And it was the same powers, Soviet Union, East Germany, Cuba, were involved more on the military side, and then regarding the finance and the kind of non-military assistance, the Scandinavian countries played a major role there.
Right.
Also,
Now talking
supporting all of these movements.
Yeah. Now talking about overseas influence in South Africa, one of the areas that
just the one thing I
Sure.
also wanted
Go
to
ahead.
mention. I've always found it a mystery that an organization like the ANC could have, transformed or undergone a metamorphosis in the early 90s from this clandestine Marxist terrorist movement to a so-called democratic political party.
it doesn't work.
And even, winning the election in 1994. How on earth did they manage to do that? Because we know that the ANC cannot organize,
kitchen party.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Well, that
I mean,
brings me to
even their own gatherings now, they have to get outside companies, these so-called event. What do they call them?
event management.
Yes, event management. That's it. These event managers who have to organize their parties for them because they are too useless to do it themselves, and they pay millions to these people just to arrange like a dinner or a steak dinner, or not even or even their political parties dinners and so on.
Well, that brings me to
I've always wondered how on earth did they manage to organize an election. And then I also read quite recently that the Swedes were very involved in organizing the election for them.
Wow.
And the electioneering and their whole campaign. They financed it and they supplied the technical people and the organization for them to win the election. Now, I mean, if that isn't, I kind of tweeted not so long ago to the Swedish ambassador in Pretoria, who's a woman called Cecilia Julin, or Julin, I suppose you would say in Swedish. I said, you're actually involved in some form of neo-colonialism here. I mean, they think of themselves as some sort of colonial power who should determine the destiny of South Africa. Where have you seen that? A Nordic country, thousands of kilometers from us, they're up almost in the North Pole, in the snowy environment. From there, they are determining our future here.
Well, I want to.
How absurd is that?
Dan, I want to actually unpack that a bit more. When we talk about overseas influence in South Africa, there's one group that comes to mind, and that's the non-government organizations, and in particular, the Open Society Foundation and George Soros. Now, I know that with Thabo Mbeki, when he was president, most of his advisors were ex-Soros senior staff in NGOs in South Africa, and they were basically giving him directions. You can add a whole lot more to this, so I'm going to hand it over to you to tell us about NGOs, what are they up to in South Africa, and how it's damaging the country.
Well, of course that one of the major propaganda victories of the ANC was a certain meeting with South African authors and intellectuals and academics, journalists and so on in 1987 in Dakar in Senegal. And Thabo Mbeki spoke to Van Zyl Slabbert there, and Van Zyl Slabbert got the notion that Thabo was really his buddy now, and they were excellent friends, and apparently he gave him a lift to the airport. And then Thabo Mbeki flew from there after his fraternizing with Van Zyl Slabbert. He flew to Moscow, and where he was going to plan with the Russians the next terrorist attack on South Africa, and including the so-called Operation Bula, which was a major underground operation meant to actually overthrow the old government. So it shows you how devious the ANC was even back then. But that meeting would never have taken place, that Dakar gathering, if it hadn't been for George Soros, because Van Zyl Slabbert and Alex Bahrain, who was Tutu's second in command at the Truth Commission, they had actually gone to New York not too long before that, and then they heard about this rich guy who'd taken on the Bank of England in 1980, it was a little bit before that, Soros's operation against the pound, that was in the early 90s. But they heard about this rich guy in New York, and they went to see him, and he wrote them a check for $100,000 to organize this gathering in Dakar. So from that moment on, Soros was very much involved in South Africa, and to this day he is involved here through his Open Society Foundation. And they've got their own foundation here, but they also fund a lot of the other NGOs in South Africa to make sure that we stay on the kind of left-wing cultural Marxist track, determined from New York and from Stockholm and a few other places. And you find that these names like the Open Society Foundation and also the Swedish International Development Aid, they crop up all over the place when you talk about these NGOs. Almost all of them get money from those two institutions, as well as also some of the other Scandinavian embassies, and then some of the major companies in South Africa too. I mentioned also this Plaas outfit down in the Cape, and I was looking up something about Plaas, and yes, and they've got a whole list of funders, and including also Open Society Foundation and
is that run by a woman who
Day.
Is that run by a
Yes,
woman
exactly.
who actually writes the policy for who writes the policy for EWC?
Yes, there's a board.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah, there's a board of people running Plaas. Actually, I had it open here on my machine. Oh, yes. Okay, here. Okay, I looked at the financial overview just to give you an idea. I mean, what sort of money is sloshing around in that outfit? Okay, in 2018, their income was 26 million rand. And there's a whole list of foreign donors, Austrian Development Agency, Claude Leon Foundation, Copenhagen Business School, DAAD, that's the German Overseas Educational Development, Institute of Development Studies, Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada, Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, Open Society Foundation, there you've got it, yeah. Soros gave them 4.3 million, okay?
Wow.
Oxfam, Packard Foundation, Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Now, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is the political foundation in Germany attached to the old Communist Party, which now calls itself Die Linke. And there, University of Sweden, Agricultural, they also give them money. There's a whole list of them here.
Yeah. Can I just interrupt you for a second there, Dan? Just for the people, we've got about 700 people watching right now, and I just want them to understand that this whole agenda of expropriation of land without compensation is not being planned by the ANC government. It's actually been planned and actually developed by this organization Dan's talking about now, called Plaas.
Yes.
And they are funded by Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros. So you can see how policy is being impacted in South Africa by people and organizations that have absolutely no interest in the country at all. They just have their own agenda. Back to you, Dan.
Yes. Now, I mean, ironically, this organization is called Plaas, but it's got nothing to do with the Plaas. It's
a farm.
It's something to do with poverty, land, and agrarian studies. The Institute for Poverty, Land, and Agrarian Studies. And there's about a dozen people there doing the so-called research, including this Professor Ruth Hall.
That's a woman.
Exactly. And she appears on photographs with Ramaphosa, and she actually writes the agricultural policy for the ANC. She's an extreme leftist. She's a Marxist. She wants to Sovietize South African agriculture. She wants to introduce collective farming, just like they did in the Soviet Union when they had those huge famines in the 1930s. That is exactly what she's pushing for. And she's got a PhD from the University of Oxford in England. So people listen to her. And she's living in this fantasy world where she wants to get rid of all our farmers and replace them with these third world peasants who will farm on small plots of land and produce food for us. That's her idea, that's her plan. And, you know, if ever that policy is finally applied in South Africa, you can be certain that our entire agricultural economy would go down the tubes, and we would need, just like Zimbabwe, we would need food aid just to feed our population. But that's, and you know, the rest of them are all of the same, cut from the same cloth. You know, there's a couple of other professors, one Andries de Tooy, he's also studied at another university in the UK. You know, British Marxism is very influential in South Africa. People who've gone to Britain to study at some of these universities and departments in the UK where they are outright Marxists, there's a sort of a British school of Marxism, including a guy called Ernesto Laclau. I think he's from Argentina, but he spent most of his life in the UK. And one of the plus people, in fact, the main guy there, his name is Professor Andries de Tooy. He did his PhD at the University of Sussex, I think, under Ernesto Laclau. So, you know, you can see ideologically, all of these people have leanings towards the extreme left. They are even left of the ANC, and they are pushing for the expropriation without compensation agenda.
Well, they're writing the policy.
Exactly. Because, you know, a lot of those government ministers and even the people in their departments who are their cronies, they don't do very much work. You know, they go to meetings, talk a lot, and lounge around in five-star hotels and go on overseas trips. But these plus people from these NGOs, you know, they are out there in the background, sitting in front of their computers, and they are churning out this stuff, and those documents go straight into the ministries, and from there it becomes government policy. It's almost copy pasted from their so-called research that they are producing. This bunch of left-wing activists and academics.
Now,
and that's how the system works in South Africa. You know, you know, we've been taken over. We've been, not only has the ANC taken us over, but all these foreigners have taken us over, and they are, we are kind of guinea pigs in their experiment, because I mean, the UK, Boris Johnson wouldn't allow somebody like Ruth Hall to run around in England determining agricultural policy in the UK, but it's fine for her to do it here. You know, and the same thing in Sweden. They're very careful about you know, their economic policies and decisions taken there. They won't, you know, they won't start applying, you know, Cuban-style Marxism in Sweden anytime soon. But they are funding it here in South Africa, because, you know, it's kind of, we're the guinea pigs, and we're being experimented on by all these foreigners.
What I'd like to now turn your attention to is how these non-government organizations are breaking down the family unit. in South Africa, the ways they're doing this? Because I think you have some inside information on that.
Yes, I once met up with a woman in a cafe. I mean, I saw her regularly there, and eventually they had a meeting in the cafe, and then I started talking to her, and I've unfortunately forgotten the name of the organization, but I'm sure I'll be able to get hold of it again. But they were involved in services to the prostitutes in the inner city of Johannesburg, especially Hillbrow, Maria, places like that. Supplying them with condoms and helping them to ply their trade there, and then also limiting the transmission of HIV. And they were also being funded from abroad, from some of these donors. And and instead of actually trying to combat prostitution in South Africa and pimping and everything that goes with it, and applying the law, I mean, there are laws still in South Africa, they're just kind of facilitating this whole business out there. And together with that goes the drugs, of course, and there are a lot of Nigerians involved in that business, in prostitution and drugs, and that's how organized crime has grown in South Africa, hand in hand with these do-gooder kind of NGOs,
right,
who have got no moral principles whatsoever, but they've just got ideological principles, and the notion of sex work sounds nice to them because feminists use that term, so they're going to support the sex work. But there are quite a few other very powerful NGOs. I once had a one-man protest in front of the Constitutional Court in Johannesburg, and there I saw there was the kind of opposition there. I was kind of alone, and the opposition had hired a kind of rent a crowd. I mean, they had all these black people with placards. But when I asked them, what are you doing here? What's this all about? They couldn't even tell me what they were protesting about. And they were actually being paid by this bunch, Section 27. And there was a British, there's the main figure there is somebody called Mark Haywood. And he's from the UK as well. Another, I would call him British Marxist. Apparently he was also involved with the ANC in Britain or something like that. And they now run this NGO that employs about 12 or 15 lawyers, and they're constantly making court cases, especially to do with education, and they are attacking some of the, especially the Afrikaans schools, Afrikaans government schools, and they're pushing for, first of all, I think for free education. I don't know how that's going to work in South Africa because there's not enough money from the government to fund the current, all the schools in South Africa. And the free schools, are not all that good. But they also get involved in other more ideological court cases, which they then take right up to the Constitutional Court. And I had a look at their list of funders. And yes, you've also got, again, I think, let me see. Yeah, Open Society Foundations. You've got
George Soros.
them involved. George Soros, as well as the Swedes, Swedish International Development Aid, and a whole bunch of others, Donald Gordon Foundation, and also Ford Foundation, Claude Leon Foundation, Anglo Gold, Ashanti, Anglo American. A lot of these big companies, Discovery, Massmart, and others. Oh yes, Mary Oppenheimer Daughters Foundation. A lot of these rich people and companies, they pay off these leftists to leave them alone.
Right.
That's how it works.
Right.
It's
That's
kind
very
of protection.
interesting. Yeah.
They're paying protection money
Wow.
to these people who then go and attack the little guy and the little school. I mean, this bunch, Section 27, I know they made a case against an Afrikaans school in Carletonville. I mean, Carletonville is not a wealthy area. So those poor parents and the governing body of that school, they had to stand up, against this outfit being funded by major corporations, foreign governments, foundations, George Soros, all of these people. I mean, they go and attack those people, but they leave these powerful organizations who sometimes pollute the country, or they commit all sorts of misdemeanors, these big businesses as well. They leave them alone because they've already paid their protection money to the NGO. And on the ideological front, of course, you've got, and where it comes to South Africa's security, our security policy, you've got the Institute for Security Studies, and they also funded by a lot of these German political party foundations. They're also quite active in South Africa, the Germans,
Right.
including this, Rosa Luxemburg Foundation from the ex-Communist Party, having changed its name but not its policies.
Let's turn our attention specifically to George Soros and the Open Society Foundation, because he is central to just about everything that we're talking about here. He's like the funder. He's like got the bank account that he just pours money into people and organizations. And one of the areas that he funds is media in South Africa. For example, the Mail and Guardian. He pours millions of rands into the Mail and Guardian. And there's another online paper, I just can't think of the name right now. It's got like a brownish header to its webpage.
Well, you're not thinking about Daily Maverick or something like that?
I think that's it, Daily Maverick, yes.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
those sort of papers get millions of rands every year from the Open Societies Foundation. And when you consider how the media is so fake in South Africa when it comes to covering real issues, you can start getting a picture as to why they have the agenda they do, because of their backers like George Soros. Now, my question to you, Dan, is what is Open Society Foundation's agenda in South Africa? What is their end game? What are they looking to achieve?
Well, I've already mentioned this idea that we kind of a guinea pig in various respects, because we had kind of a regime change in the early 90s. We were one of the first countries to go through regime change. Then they applied the same thing in North Africa, in the Arab countries, where it was an utter disaster. Not that ours isn't a disaster, but it's kind of less, it's less extreme, I would say, because in those countries they just degenerated into civil war and strife, and they became failed states, places like Libya and Tunisia and Egypt. I mean, I was in Egypt, in Cairo in 2010, sort of late 2010, just before they had the first revolution there. So, they were involved in the regime change, and now they are trying to keep it on track, because they're obviously seeing, how many problems that we've got, and they're trying to kind of hedge their bets or protect their asset. But we're kind of a multicultural experiment, where you've got a first world economy and a first world population, Western population, ruled by an Afro-Marxist movement, and where where the third world elements are becoming more and more prominent. Also the corruption and the degradation, squalor. If you look at the city centre of Johannesburg, it's absolutely awful. The same goes for all the others. Durban, Cape Town. Well, Cape Town's not so bad, but Durban, terrible. Pretoria, terrible. Bloemfontein, they all look awful.
Yeah.
So I think they are trying, they want to do this to the whole world. They want to throw open the borders, and
Why?
Paris will become. That's a good question. Why do they want to do that? I think first of all they see themselves as so rich and powerful that they can do anything, and they will be protected from the consequences because they are living in these enclaves where they've got security and wealth and luxury all around them, so they don't care about how the other half lives. It gets even more extreme. If you look at this whole Jeffrey Epstein thing, wow.
Yeah.
You're talking about pedophilia, sex slavery, who knows what. These people are really
disgusting.
Almost like Satanists.
They're disgusting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there is that element as well. So they could even be motivated by some form of sadism in torturing us. I wouldn't actually put it past them. That's part of their motivation is to see us suffer here in South Africa. All revolutions have such an element. I lived in France. Towards the end, I lived right almost on the square where the Bastille prison used to be, where that was the main symbolic moment of the revolution when they stormed the Bastille and liberated all the prisoners. But there were only 7 prisoners inside. But that was seen as overthrowing the king, and eventually, yes, and then you had the so-called terror, la terreur, as they say in French, awful, where they guillotined the aristocracy, and just a complete bloodbath. They even had. I visited some other country area where they told me that they had mass drownings there. They threw people into rivers who couldn't swim and made them drown. That's what they did during the French Revolution. So there's a sort of a sadistic, very dark aspect to every revolution. The Russian Revolution, the same. And we've also had a kind of a revolution, and we're still having one at the moment. And that's why you get these farm murders and torture and these awful atrocities happening. So I think it's all part of the package, and all these rich and powerful people and foreign governments from outside, they are manipulating us and steering us in a certain direction, and we are part of their little experiment.
So just to sum this up really simply, what we're saying here, if I'm not mistaken, is that the elected officials who are members of parliament, who get up there and make these fancy speeches, are actually being directed by unelected NGOs or people who work for NGOs like George Soros's Open Society Foundation. They're actually giving them the directions on where South Africa is going, giving them the policy that they vote for in Parliament. This has got nothing to do with the ANC government, who are the elected officials. It's actually the people who work for these NGOs in the background who are actually putting together the policy documents which are then tabled and become law in South Africa. Is that correct?
Yes, I think you are correct. And if you add the media element to that, I mean, the way they are manipulating public opinion as well, yeah, you've got a perfect system. You know, they say in a dictatorship, you have to control the army. But in a democracy, you have to control the media, because ultimately people vote on the basis of how they've been influenced by the media. And in South Africa, yes, our media, they also have a very, they have a very strong agenda, which kind of coincides with that of the foreign NGOs and the foreign governments as well. And that's also why sometimes you see them criticizing the ANC, because then they think the ANC is now getting off the track and they must get back onto it, onto the predetermined program. They're not following the program. They're not following the script.
Well, I have to tell you, Dan, when I hear this, and I can totally believe what you're saying, but when I hear this, it really brings into focus two agendas of the United Nations, Agenda 2020 and Agenda 2030. They're basically like a script for the future for the world, and it all goes back to the deep state running everything. And when you consider what's happening in South Africa, as we said, with the policies actually written by unelected NGOs who actually then direct the elected ANC government on where they're going, this is absolutely crazy.
Yes, it is. You've got a similar thing in Europe, of course, where the officials in Brussels, they are setting the policy, and a lot of the national parliaments have just become rubber stamps for what's being decided by unelected officials in Brussels. About 60% of all laws passed in the national parliaments now have to do with decisions made in, just rubber stamping decisions made in Brussels.
Right.
So we are tending towards this kind of international government kind of a situation, and it's interesting with this virus and the role of the World Health Organization, how they are also giving orders to governments and telling them what to do, including the South African government.
Now, Jurgens has made a very interesting comment or observation. You must have heard of Sina van Rensburg.
Yes, I have.
Okay,
yes.
Now Jurgens says, anybody notice what Dan Roodt is wearing? The man in the brown suit.
Okay. Yeah, it is actually just a jacket. But I've got another suit which is got a little bit of green in it, but it is brown. Yes, I sometimes wear it, and then I think to myself, yeah.
For those who are not aware about Sina van Rensburg and the implication here, Sina says that when the Afrikaners come back and take over their own country, there'll be a man with a brown suit who will be basically leading them. Okay, now.
Well, let's hope it's going to happen, because it's
got to happen. It will happen.
Tired of waiting. It will, because I there are just too many stresses at the moment in the system for it just to go on like this.
Let's face it, the South African economy is heading for a huge collapse. It's going to be a huge, it's going to be worse than a recession. It's going to be a depression in South Africa.
Yes.
There's no question about that. Now, talking about the current situation, how has the lockdown impacted people, and this overt manner in which the lockdown has been enforced, with the army being deployed and the police being a joke in the streets trying to keep people with social distancing? Do you think that this very harsh lockdown is once again being directed by the NGOs and what's actually happening right now?
Well, I think they are getting advice from overseas, from probably the World Health Organization and so on. But they are in the wings, I think, certain people also giving directions to Ramaphosa and the rest of the government. But, I mean, I think that this virus is a very serious situation. You know, I see these kind of protests they're having in the US now where people are driving around in their cars with messages saying, oh, it's just the flu and, you know, and this is all just a hoax and so on. I don't quite think it's a hoax. It is a serious virus. We don't know everything about it yet, and it can impact you in all sorts of ways. You know, not everybody gets sick from it, but the ones who do, they get seriously ill, they die, and they can even have brain damage. And yeah, it is a serious situation. But I think the ANC is also using it as a kind of a show of strength, and that's why they deployed the army and the police, and a lot of the measures are a bit over the top and too draconian. I mean, I live in a place where there is social distancing. I mean, we don't live very close to one another here. And where I could maybe go for a walk or jog or cycle around without getting close to anybody, but it's banned just because the government says so. So it's not entirely rational, everything that they are doing. And then there's a shortage, so there's still a I mean, we are supposed to, they're saying that from Friday, when we go to stage 4 of the lockdown, it's going to be slightly less draconian. If you take public transport, you have to wear a mask, but there's a huge shortage of masks. I mean, I managed to get a few just before the whole thing hit, but you know, I'm sure most people out there don't have masks.
You're right.
So how on earth are they going to be wearing these masks that are being required by the government? And they're not manufacturing them locally, as far as I know, although they're talking about funding that sort of activity. But you still don't find any masks anywhere.
Yeah, we had a question here from someone who said, please make a list of all these shocking NGOs and put in links on your site, or send us all a newsletter. Now, the best way to...
Yeah, I'll definitely do that. I mean, you know, I think we should do that. You know, we should kind of list them, who they are, what they're doing, and just to keep an eye out for them.
Fantastic.
Because they are definitely... I mean, Putin banned these organizations from Russia, or he banned the funding of them, because he knew that if he let them be, they were going to overthrow his government sooner or later. That's what they ultimately do. And if you see what happened in Ukraine, that's another country that was completely destroyed. I mean, it's now just a basket case in a failed state, and it was also destroyed by the likes of George Soros. He was heavily involved there. So yes, I mean, they are very dangerous, and they can make things a lot worse.
And you're talking about the social infrastructure in places like the Ukraine as well. Just like with what's happening in South Africa, they're trying to break down the social infrastructure, the family unit. They're trying to get rid of that, because then you weaken the response when things go really pear-shaped. Now,
yes,
clearly,
I mean, there was another
sorry, I'm just going to say, Dan.
Sure.
I'm just going to say that one of the problems that these NGOs have is the strength of faith of the Afrikaners and the Boers, their religious faith and their culture. And I think that's why they're being targeted, because they're seen as a potential problem for their own agenda. What are your views on that?
No, you're definitely right. Because, you know, we've got more kind of traditional values. in the world at the moment, there's a conflict between this progressivism and tradition or traditionalism. And people who are attached to their traditions, they are the ones being targeted by these progressive NGOs and leftists and politicians. If you think about it, there was another NGO, and not a very big one or anything, it's just a bunch of people who got together, but they also got lawyers to take their case up to the Constitutional Court, and they got a court order against an Afrikaans school where they had, kind of morning prayer and that kind of thing once a week. So that was then completely banned in all government schools, because once you've got a Constitutional Court decision, all the schools have to abide by it. So they specifically went after this one school in order to force, in order to ban religion in all the schools. But at the same time, in some of the schools where there are Muslims, they can do what they like, and they also they can take the Muslim holidays, even though it's not on the school calendar. No problem with that. But the Christians, they are going after them and making sure that they drive them further and further, into a corner. And of course, the whole gay issue has been especially manipulated among the Afrikaners in order to weaken all the churches and cause a lot of division and infighting. Ultimately, it's going to destroy the Afrikaans churches. This whole controversy and the fight around whether gays should be married in the church or not. And they also, of course, they got a court order against the church forcing them to marry gays. And so now the churches have to do it, but there are some of them, some of the congregations who are saying that they are now in a state of, what do you call it? And there's a sort of a technical term in Afrikaans for that day, which is from the Latin dolus, which means sorrow. So they are now in a state of sorrow about that. But yes, they don't talk about anything else now in the Afrikaans church circles and at the synod meetings and so on. It's all just about gays, and that's also being driven by these progressives and the NGOs, and they want to make sure that they foist their values and progressivism onto the three Afrikaans churches, and especially the largest one, the Dutch Reformed Church, the NGK.
Well, what I find very disturbing is how the NGOs, through the media, weaponize words like racist or homophobe or something like that. They kind of make people out to be racist when they're not, because they are not meeting their agenda, and it's all done in such a demeaning way. It's quite extraordinary what they get away with. And I think both you and I have in the past been labelled the R word. I have been, I know, and I'm certainly not a racist. But this is how they try and basically create a situation where people don't want to talk to someone because he's a racist or he's a homophobe. And really, what these people are doing.
Well, the other one, the other one that I've been thinking about recently is white supremacist.
Oh yeah.
You also see that one around quite a lot. Because I saw something on Wikipedia about white supremacists in the USA, and at the bottom of the article, they had in Wikipedia, they had a list of all these people. And then I realized that I knew about half of them personally. So, yeah, you know, you don't have to do too much to be labeled or say too much to be labeled a racist or a homophobe or a white supremacist or a male chauvinist pig, or, you know, yeah, it's there's just this constant hysteria from the left and these politically correct organizations and foundations and people. And they want to take you to court, and they want to, yeah, and the social justice warriors.
Yeah.
I mean, I even saw a movie. I mean, I can't watch Hollywood movies because it's just, you know, it's always the best, the morally superior person is always black, and he's giving the orders. He's also in a position of superiority in the organization. He's the main cop, and he's giving orders to all the whites, and the whites are kind of delinquents or irresponsible, and he's got to keep them on the right track. You know, he's the good guy.
Yeah, the shoe's actually on the other foot.
Yes, exactly. And then, of course, all the women are super strong. They're all super women, and one woman can beat up 3 men. You know, she's a feminist, and she, you know, it's.
No,
and of course, yeah, and then the swearing. You know, I mean, it's in every sentence. There's the F word.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you're not sensitive to that, I mean, it just becomes so absurd to have every sentence with the F word in it. So I don't really watch, you know, Hollywood movies or even Netflix movies. And my wife has taken to watching South Korean series because it's completely different. It's a completely different world. It's very traditional, very conservative. It's nothing, you know. Also, the kind of promiscuity in these Hollywood movies. I mean, it's girl meets boy in a bar, and then they immediately end up in bed afterwards. In a Korean movie, something like that will never happen.
Yeah.
So it's a particularly gross kind of a world that we're living in, and it's being
Can I just
driven by.
Can I just interrupt for a second there, Dan? I mean, there's this particular, and this really puts into perspective what we're talking about here. There's a new class or a new study that's been brought into South African schools this year, and it basically is suggesting to young children as young as 7 or 8 that it's fine to be gay, it's fine to have promiscuous sex. All these sort of things are being taught to youngsters as young as 7 or 8. It's actually part of the school curriculum. Now, clearly, this curriculum came through these NGOs. I mean, the ANC government could never have thought of this. These are the people behind the throne who are actually driving this. Absolutely promiscuous. It's terrible.
Yes, you're quite right, because you know, as we know, I mean, Africans, you know, feminism and all of that doesn't come naturally to you, the average African man out there. So this has all been, you know, planted from elsewhere, and yeah, you can bet there's some organization behind that. But I think it even goes further than the promiscuity and encouraging. Yeah, I mean, it's even a form of pedophilia to encourage 7-year-olds to think about, you know, to have erotic thoughts or whatever. I mean, it's just completely sick. But you know, there's also this issue of gender identity, and in a lot of the European countries, and of course in the US and Canada, they are suggesting to these young children that they should be uncertain whether they're a boy or a girl, because it's no longer, it's a choice whether it doesn't matter how you're born as a boy or a girl, you can always decide to become the other. And boys should dress up in dresses, and girls should act like boys.
It's just crazy.
It is. I mean, you know that. You know who Lauren Southern is. She visited South Africa to do a video on farm murders, and I met her here in Sandton in Johannesburg, and we had an interview together as well. And she told me that she was a man, because not that she acts like a man, but she dresses fairly traditionally like a woman, and with high heels and a black dress and so on, and makeup. But apparently in Canada, they made a law there that you could change your sex.
Yeah.
And then she went to a doctor and she got a letter from him very easily, and then she went to some government office and she gave them the letter, and they changed her gender. And
What?
She is now Mr. Lauren Southern. I mean, and she went in her dress and in her high heels to the office and she said, "I'm a man." And they accepted that.
Wow.
And she wanted to show up the absurdity of the situation.
Oh, wow.
And she told me that she once got into an argument with some leftist or feminist or something, and then she told him, "But I'm a man." And that shut them up completely, because they couldn't. That person didn't have a retort to that. Plus, the law in Canada states that if you doubt the gender of a person who's changed his gender, that's a criminal offense.
Wow.
So if that guy had kind of told her, no, but I can see you're a woman, then she could have charged him with an offense. And you know that, I mean, Jordan Peterson became famous when he said that he wasn't going to respect all of this stuff, and then they were threatening to fire him from the university and so on. So that's the kind of, this very sick
kind of crap that's going on. Now I've got a few questions.
Yes.
That we've got. Okay, Harm Timmerman asks, Scott, can you ask Dan to explain to the viewers how the Rothschilds made their money with the Battle of Waterloo?
Yes, I've actually, I've read a book on the Rothschilds. There's a very, I think Hobsbawm or somebody. I mean, there's quite a famous British historian who wrote a book on them. I think it was Hobsbawm. But, they essentially they were money lenders. So, because the old Jacob Rothschild, he started off in the ghetto in Frankfurt, in the Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt. And then he sent his sons, one son to Paris and the other one to London. They were money lenders. They were first in the textile business, and they were actually smuggling textile as well, because there were taxes on it, kind of import, sort of duties on these imports, but somehow they got around paying the duty, but eventually the son in London got into banking. And during the Napoleonic Wars, there was a British army or a mercenary. I mean, it's all mercenaries most of the time in Spain, and they had to be paid. So then, first of all, the Rothschilds started lending money to England in order to wage the war, on which they got interest, very good interest rates. And then they had to pay the army in Spain, and the government couldn't do it because they didn't have the Spanish currency to pay them out there in Spain. So the Rothschilds arranged all that. They got some gold from the from the Bank of England, and they shipped it out, and they then exchanged it. They got the foreign currency, and they did all the deals, and eventually the army was paid there in Spain. So they were kind of oiling the machine of the kind of British war machine against Napoleon, and of course the Rothschild son in Paris, he was doing deals with the French, so they were all kind of profiting from the war. But ultimately, yes, there was a very famous saying by one of the Rothschilds that you must, I know they're saying in French, but if you translate it, it means you should sell when you hear the cannons on a stock exchange and buy when you hear the sound of the violins. And they also, there was that very famous story where after the Battle of Waterloo, the people in England didn't know who won the battle, because obviously there weren't telephones or telegrams or electricity even way back then. So then the Rothschilds had a system of lanterns across the channel on ships, so that they would know first who'd won the battle and whether they should buy or sell on the stock exchange. And they got the message first, and then, and obviously the Rothschild son in London, he bought up all the shares and bonds, and he could. And that's how the family became the richest family in the world, just almost overnight.
I can add a bit
They also
more.
used apparently homing pigeons between the cities in Europe, between Frankfurt and Paris, to kind of arbitrage on the prices of shares at the different bourses in Europe.
Yeah, I can add a bit more to that story. When it came to the actual trading in the stock market that day, Nathan Rothschild walked in. I mean, everybody knew who Nathan Rothschild was, and he was selling. He was selling all his stock, and he was just selling his stock, and everybody said, "Oh my God, England must have lost." So everybody started dumping their stock, and all of a sudden he bought it all up for nothing.
Yeah, at the rock bottom.
Bottom prices.
I forgot about, you're quite right. I also read in this biography on the Rothschilds about that one. Yes.
Okay, now I've got another question from Gordon Blues. Guys, if you want to put your questions, or the moderators, if you can start posting the questions that have been asked earlier, I'll put them to Dan. Okay, Gordon has said, I have a question. Has Dan ever watched the interview of Norman Dodds by G. Edward Griffin, uncovering the New World Order agenda to take over academia by the way of the tax-exempt foundations in the USA?
No, I'm afraid I haven't. I'd be interested to see that, because a lot of these tax-exempt foundations, of course, the Rockefellers have used them to great effect, because apparently the Rockefellers don't pay any tax whatsoever, and all the family's money is locked up in these non-profit foundations, and that's the way they've become so wealthy, because they never pay tax.
Now, Eddie asks, ask your guest who finances the EFF. Everything for free party.
Yeah, I've heard, look, there have been these pictures of Julius Malema and that ex-British ambassador to South Africa, Baron Robin Rennick. Now, that's not to say that there's UK money that coming to the EFF, but it's certainly quite curious that somebody like that should be on such good terms with Malema. But, I've heard other rumors, but I wouldn't, one would have to research it a bit. I wouldn't offhand be able to put my head on a block to say who finances Malema. But there must be somebody behind him, because he's always got money, and he seems to be living a very lavish lifestyle as well.
Right. Now, Dee asks, Scott, why are the legal firms not collaborating and taking the ANC to task?
Well, you know, these legal firms in Sandton, a lot of them are also quite close to these NGOs, and some of them are very liberal and leftist as well. And, you know, some of these legal firms were part of the whole ANC takeover in the late 80s, early 90s. So, you know, they wouldn't, as it were, take on their own comrades. And then the courts, I'm not too sure that our courts are all that independent anymore. And you probably won't win a significant case against the ANC government on an important issue. You know, I don't think anyone has really tried, but okay, AfriForum and Solidarity, they've tried on affirmative action. You know, they had their 10-year case running concerning Captain Renata Kutsia, who didn't get promotion in the police because she was white. And they won it in the appeal court, as far as I remember, but they lost it in the constitutional court. So when it comes to the constitutional court, you know, that court is pro-ANC, and you're not going to make much headway there.
So they've put their own cadres in as judges.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, they've been there for 26 years, so I guess they've had the time to do that. Okay, now, Dalen has asked, were the Rothschilds involved with the Anglo-Boer War?
I'm actually not too sure. I mean, yes, I think they definitely were. I know that the Rothschilds had a stake in De Beers for a long time. So they must have been involved in the whole pre-war kind of hysteria against Paul Kruger, and the press in Johannesburg went to, you know, the so-called Uitlander press went completely wild in blowing up out of all proportion the issues around voting rights and the courts, and in order to cause the war. But I was, you know, so I think there was, I mean, the banking fraternity in London, they were definitely in favor of the war, and they sought to profit from it, if only because they would probably also be lending money to the British government to finance the war effort. So they must have made money out of it. Right. But I was also told an anecdote by P.W. Botha personally, you know, when I visited him down there in George over a weekend. You know, I was invited there by him and his second wife, Barbara. I had very interesting discussions with him. But one of the things he told me, and I mean, he wouldn't have lied to me because he had no reason to at that stage. I mean, he's out of politics and elderly and just reminiscing about his life in politics and as state president. He told me a story that right about 1982, he got a visit from one of the Rothschild bankers. And this person told him that in Switzerland, they had a lot of accounts at their Swiss branch where the person was deceased and the heirs were untraceable. So in a lot of other countries, that money would then revert to the state, because when you can't trace the owner, it reverts to the state. But in Switzerland, the bank has to keep it in the name of that account, and the state will never get that money. And so this Rothschild banker told PW that, they could channel some of that money to him because he could claim it, and they would just, transfer it to his account in Switzerland, no problem, and no strings attached. Wow. The guy just said, we just want to, we feel you deserve it. And so PW said no, because he told me, as soon as I take their money, then they've bought me. So I refuse to take money from anybody. So yes, it makes you wonder about all the other people who got the same offer, and who didn't say no.
Yeah. Okay, now I've got another question here. Boerenvechter. Dan, what is your take on the 70,000 soldiers being deployed in South Africa? Something tells me they expect an attack, maybe a coup by the United Nations. Signers saw a Thornbush government would take over.
Yeah, it is quite odd that they should have, put all these soldiers on the street. But I think it's more a kind of show and a demonstration of ANC power, because I think a lot of people don't have a good opinion of the SANDF, and they maybe wanted to show that they were still there and still capable of, driving around and supposedly maintaining order. But apparently it's also costing a huge amount of money in the billions of rands. So, with a country being so financially stressed at the moment, it doesn't make sense to me that they should be doing that.
Right.
But I suspect that, they are thinking that there might be civil unrest quite soon as a result of this lockdown. So I think they're also hedging their bets, especially in the townships. There could be riots or uprisings, and then the police on their own wouldn't be able to handle that.
Well, I have to tell you that at the very start of this live stream, there's a lady who lives in Belleville South in Cape Town, and she said that the looting that is happening right now in their area is extraordinary. Shops and stuff like that, and she said the police are just watching. This is the anarchy that's happening in South Africa right now. It's not good.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, we've been in this situation actually for quite a while now, because I read somewhere that there were about 15 so-called protests every day in South Africa, and 50% of them turn violent. So there are at least 7 riots taking place every day in South Africa, and we've just become used to it.
Yeah, it doesn't even get reported.
And now, it doesn't even get reported, exactly. In the old days, when there was a riot under the old government, then the BBC would be there, and Agence France Presse, and Reuters, and everybody, and then the country's burning, whereas in the next street, everything would be normal. Right. But now, everybody is just ignoring it, including the foreign media.
Now, Michelle's made a really interesting statement, and this resonates with me. She says, with that amount of money, it sounds like it's an opportunity to loot some more, always looking for an opportunity. Now, what we're really talking about is super wealthy families like the Rothschilds, like the Soroses, who've got so much money. Money doesn't mean anything anymore. They're looking for power. Their whole motivation is not money, it's power, because they are so wealthy. And that's what's happening with these NGOs in South Africa, which are now controlling the actual direction the ANC government is going.
Yes, I think she's right. They are looking for power because the money is not enough. you want to have real hard power as well, and being able to put soldiers on the ground or influence political decisions. You see it with somebody like Bill Gates as well. I mean, he's a computer nerd who almost by accident became the richest man in the world.
Right.
And now he's also meddling in all sorts of things, including his vaccines, health policy all over the world, and the World Health Organization. He and his ex-secretary, who's now his wife, she's probably the one who's doing all the admin for him. He's trying to be a mover and a shaker.
Yeah. Now, Gordon's asked, is there any truth to the rumors of secret consignments of Chinese weapons being smuggled in from Botswana, allegedly to the EFF?
Yeah, I haven't heard about that, so, I'd like to see more information about that. If it's true, it could be highly worrying. The EFF is, we haven't really talked about them much, but they are a pretty sinister bunch, I think, and they are far more extreme than the ANC. And I also saw this, I see Julius Malema has put out some sort of a speech today on Freedom Day, and he's calling for the unification of Africa. And he's got all kinds of ambitions. He seems to not only want to rule South Africa, but even rule the whole of Africa, which seems completely megalomaniac. But so we're going to have to watch the EFF, I think. And there are all sorts of rumors also that they are, if they're not directly involved in the farm murders, they are actually creating the sort of climate, the ideological climate for these farm murders to take place.
Yeah. Now, Dagbreker has asked, if the ANC fails, what are the chances of voters running to the EFF? Is it similar, like when Smuts lost to Herzog?
Yes, incidentally, I think I once thought to myself, or I think I might have mentioned it to someone, that Hitler came to power with only a minority of the vote, and it's happened a lot in history that the minority party, they might get the minority of the votes, but ultimately they would come to power within a coalition.
Right.
And then one day on the radio, I heard one of these leftist, Marxist, feminist commentators that you always hear on, especially the Afrikaans radio these days, Professor Christie van der Westhuizen, who used to be a journalist at Beeld. And she was saying exactly that same thing, that Malema could come to power with a minority of the votes in a coalition with the ANC. And he could seize power that way and become a kind of a dictator, and and then realize all of his other ambitions, such as becoming the kind of leader of Africa. And he's young enough and it's extreme enough to perhaps at least partially realize some of his ambitions and fantasies.
Right.
So, one shouldn't underestimate the EFF, even though they seem like a bunch of clowns a lot of the time. But within, the media and the ANC takeover have also created this climate for these extreme ideas to flourish. And, we don't find it strange anymore that somebody like Malema should make pronouncements like that occupy the farms or nationalize the banks. He says things like that, and we don't find it strange anymore because we've become inured to it and conditioned to accept these extremist ideas. Whereas if you say something a bit more towards the traditional side, like maybe school prayer should not be banned, then you are immediately derided as a fascist and a Nazi and everything else that goes with it. There was an American political scientist with a surname Overton, and he had this theory of which they then called afterwards the Overton window, that in any society at any time there's a set of ideas or ideologies that are acceptable and considered mainstream, and that's the Overton window, and anything outside that is considered extremist or unacceptable.
Right.
But it can shift to the right or to the left. And in South Africa, the Overton window, since the late 80s, has been constantly shifting to the left, and it's still going there. So something that was considered sort of mainstream or even to the center, maybe in the mid-80s, is now considered extreme right-wing and unmentionable, whereas somebody like Malema, who previously would have been considered some kind of a madman, he's now the mainstream. He's in there. He's just sort of slightly left of center at the moment.
Right. Okay, now there are a couple of interesting questions that have come through, and there are two which are basically associated, so I'm going to fire both of them to you together. It's Me Again asks if the Rothschilds are puppets from those above them. And I would suggest that Satan is their master. But we'll put that question to Dan after I just put this other question as well. Gordon's just asked, here's another. Does Dan feel that the world's rich list is a sham? Aren't the richest people so rich and powerful we don't even know their names?
Well, I think when you look at there's the Sunday Times rich list. Are there two questions there from different people? The one was...
Yeah. The other one is ask if the Rothschilds are puppets from those above them.
Yeah. Well, there could be some kind of a religious impulse, or I don't know, some demonic impulse, or whatever you might want to call it. But I think for maybe the last 200 years, they've been one of the richest, if not the richest family on planet Earth. So I don't think anybody, there's nobody else rich enough to pull their strings, as it were. And they can probably buy most politicians in the UK or wherever. But and once you get into all of this occult stuff, there is a lot of it seems nowadays, especially after this whole Jeffrey Epstein bizarre thing in the US, and then some of the stuff coming out of Hollywood as well. It's just horrific. And then there does seem to be some kind of satanic cult in Hollywood and among some of these celebrities and rich people. But I don't have too much information about that. I've just spotted a few photographs and articles on that. Right. But the other question was to do, what was the second question again?
Hang on, let me get that for you. It's does Dan feel that the world's rich list is a sham?
Oh, is a sham. Okay, yes. Well, there's a Sunday Times rich list in South Africa. I think Nikki Oppenheimer is still number one, and maybe number two is Johan Rupert, and then it's Patrice Motsepe and Chris Bakker and a few other people. And then, of course, there's the Forbes list of the 500 richest people in the world. But those are mostly people with publicly listed assets, such as shares, or where you can actually see, okay, you can work out. I mean, Bill Gates owns X percentage of Microsoft, so you just multiply that by the market capitalization at any given moment of Microsoft, and then you can work out more or less how much money Bill Gates has. And the same goes for Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon.com, who's now apparently the richest person in the world. And he's just got divorced from his wife, so his wife was also ended up on the rich list. Well, I saw a joke. I mean, there was sort of a graph that she's the most astute investor in the world because she married him. Amazon stock was rock bottom, and she got divorced when it was right at the top. So she made a very good investment.
Oh wow!
But yes, but there are people definitely with non-listed assets, including in South Africa, who are extremely wealthy and potentially powerful, and they are in the shadows because they don't get written about. You just hear about them here and there. People whisper about them and so on, but yeah, and they probably have billions in a Swiss bank account or bars of gold in a vault somewhere. And yes, because they're so anonymous, they are possibly
flying under the radar.
Yes, exactly.
Now, Pura Fechter has asked, Dan, do you think all white property will be taken?
Well, I'm not sure. At the present moment, I would say probably not, although it's possible. But with Plaas behind, but the problem comes with farmland, and I think there, despite what some of these, people in organized agriculture, and especially Agri-SA and Mr. Dan Kriel from Grain SA, I think. I mean, they are saying it's not going to happen, but I think it is going to happen because Ramaphosa has come out in favor of that. He's committed to it, that they will confiscate the farms. And you've got Plaas and Professor Ruth Hall writing the policy for that. And they are pushing for that. So sooner or later, there's going to be a point where they will implement expropriation without compensation. And they might, even if you've got a second property or a holiday home or something, they might even take that as well. So it's within the realm of possibility, definitely. But they are going to grab something,
but
especially farmland.
If they take on the farmers, I think that's the start of the civil war. I really do. I think that.
Yes, it is going to. In all of the studies worldwide around, the confiscation of land and so-called land reform, in most cases there have been violence and civil unrest and conflict. So it is not a good idea. And apparently also the studies show that it takes a country at least 40 years to recover from that if it does recover. So it's an absolutely insane policy. And I cannot understand why these extreme people are pushing for it. It's just beyond me. But then it comes down to the fact that they are just power hungry and they are so ideologically, obtuse and living in their bubble, in their little Marxist socialist bubble, that they are prepared to push for it and make it happen.
I've got another question from Antoinette. She says, should minorities start taking to the streets to protest against the way they are treated in South Africa, like the ANC did in apartheid, in order to get our plight out into the world?
Well, Steve Hofmeyr and I have been on various protests, and I've got lots of pictures and even some video footage and so on of us in various protests. But somehow they are never massively kind of attended, and that's actually a pity. In a place like France, for example, when there's a protest, doesn't matter whether it's from the left or the right or whoever. I know when the whole gay marriage thing was, when that started becoming an issue in France, there was a lot of opposition to it. And then the more traditionally minded people, they organized a huge protest in Paris, and they arrived as families, husband and wife and their kids, showing that they are a family and they are opposed to the notion of same-sex marriage. And they had a whole movement, which they created out of nothing within a few weeks. So I think if we can do something like that in South Africa, that could be very powerful. But somehow it's not in our culture, and we're sort of scared to be out on the streets. We normally drive, we don't walk. Whereas in European cities, people walk, so they don't find it strange to be walking in the street, even on a protest or during a protest.
Right.
Whereas we are so used to driving everywhere that I think that's a factor why we can't go on protests, because we never walk around in the city. In fact, when I was in the Netherlands about a year ago or so, I saw a book there written by some journalist who's based out in the US, and the title of the book was "Americans Don't Walk because they're always driving. They never walk like Europeans do." And of course, we live in such an Americanized society with urban sprawl and cars that we don't walk either. And I think that's part of the problem, why we don't organize big protests.
Winnie's written, "I'm just an ordinary scared woman. I fear what is happening. Will I ever see my family and children again? Please don't laugh, but I'm really in a state." I just have to say, Winnie, look, I am sure that you will see your family and children again. I don't know what the circumstances are, but as people are saying in the side chat, just be strong. You know that the Loving Life channel will be always here to try and help you if we can. You're not alone. Okay, let's continue. Milton says, if young Smuts and the United Party had stayed in power for a number of years after 1948, would South Africa have turned out differently?
I doubt it very much, because there wasn't too much of a difference between Smuts' so-called native policy and that of the National Party. In fact, I mean, I've got all of Hatzel's speeches, in all 6 volumes, and I've got Roodt's speeches and Smuts' speeches as well. And in fact, in 1928, he made a speech at Oxford University where he sort of outlined the apartheid policy, and he wanted to have it applied throughout Africa. He thought it was such a good idea. And so I don't think it would have been too much different. There would have been a big difference under Smuts, but obviously he died in 1950. But afterwards, some of the successors, I mean, they may have been, I think when it came to what was called sort of petty apartheid, or this sort of segregation that we had, which they had in the southern US as well. I mean, even until the early 70s. In fact, the one candidate for the presidency in the US, Wallace, in the early 70s, his slogan was something like segregation forever. He was a staunch segregationist, and he was running for president in the early 1970s, as far as I recall. So but I think ultimately, if you also look at Rhodesia, the way it went, they had a fairly kind of a liberal racial policy in the old Rhodesia, but that was not enough to appease these radical Afro-Marxist movements supported from the outside by Red China, Soviet Union, and the Scandinavian countries. So I think it would have gone the same way regardless, and it might have happened even sooner because, if we had some form of qualified franchise in the 1960s already, I think the process would have actually accelerated from that point onwards. Because on the other side, the forces were the same. And it wasn't so much internally what we were doing here which determined the outcome, but what was being done on the outside. I think that's a difficult thing for most people to grasp, and I found it difficult myself to believe initially when I started reading up and, a lot of the stuff coming out now, especially in over the last 10 years, because it's almost as if these clandestine and underground and covert people are now boasting about everything they did back then. It's only now that we can see the enormity of what we were facing back then. I mean, I was watching a speech by Reagan on YouTube or somewhere not so long ago, a couple of days ago, where he was also being driven in a corner about South Africa, because I think he instinctively wanted to support us, but internally in the US and the US media were just making it impossible for him. But if you think how much effort it would take to put South Africa, to make of South Africa an issue even with the current US president, with President Trump, or in the US internal domestic politics, that South Africa should become an issue there. You need lots of money, lots of well-placed, strategically placed people in the system, in the media, and everywhere to make that happen. And the other side had all of that, in the 70s and 80s. So we were facing, PW spoke about the total onslaught, and I think he was right. I mean, there was not only the kind of Soviet and East German sponsored terror and subversion and destabilization, but there was also the huge propaganda and the psychological war, the information war that was going on. So whoever was in power in South Africa would have found it very difficult to stay in power or to face it. You needed some very clever people to be able to resist that. And I think we had a lot of weaknesses, especially in the intelligence service. I think they capitulated first, the national intelligence, and after that, it sort of went throughout the system and the politicians and the cabinet. And I think the police were the last. I mean, they were probably the most trustworthy of all the government departments, the police. And, we've actually published the autobiography of General Johan van der Merwe, who was head of the police at the time. And they were, they were in the front lines fighting all of this. And they were motivated and loyal, but ultimately they were just sold out, together with some of the generals who were just fired by de Klerk. Have you got any other questions? Hello, Scott?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear
Okay,
you now.
great.
Yes.
Okay, guys, just regarding the discussion in the side chat, if you want to join the Loving Life WhatsApp, it's really easy. All you have to do is go to the Loving Life homepage, look at the featured video, which is right underneath the picture at the top. Click on that, and in the description below, you'll see links to the WhatsApp, and you can just click on those and join the WhatsApp that way. That's probably the easiest way to do that. And while we're talking about Loving Life, we have a forum that was started about a week ago called Loving Life Live, one word, .co.za. You can actually go to that forum and participate there. You'll have to sign in, join the forum. We do that so we keep the spammers out. And it's a great forum, and the fellow who's running it is doing a great job. All right, now let's get back to questions. Gordon asks, my new question is there any truth to the rumors of secret consignments of Chinese weapons? I think we've covered that one, haven't we?
Yes,
we have.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I'll ask him questions from various people. And see
well,
if I can find out.
Someone in the side chat said apparently they're coming through north of Richards Bay on a boat. That's apparently where they're actually landing in South Africa. That's the conspiracy. Okay. Paddy asks Dan if he has any suggestions as to how we can take this propaganda war to the enemy.
Well, I think, the internet and things like YouTube have kind of armed us to be able to respond, because back then, in the days of newspapers, you needed hundreds of millions to buy a printing press to print a newspaper, or you had to have a radio station. But now, we've got the internet and technology and WhatsApp and all of these things to be able to get the message out. But I think there must also be more coherent thinking about the kind of message that we want to put across, and then we must try and translate it into a few simple slogans that most people can understand, and that we need to communicate to any potential sympathizers overseas. So it might be an idea at some point to brainstorm those sorts of slogans, or in the US they talk about talking points, and I think even in their intelligence community they've got talking points, and we've got to have those talking points, that we've got to have a list of 5 or 10 and make sure that we put those issues across all the time in order to make headway in this information war, which is a real war, and people, if you lose it, you die. I mean, it's as simple as that, because ultimately your own people will be so demoralized that they won't resist if they come to your home and shoot you. And and the enemy will feel that he's got so much room for maneuver, and that he can just do what he likes, and then he will, go to extremes. In fact, there was something said by Paulo Jordan once which struck me. Apparently, in the ANC, some of the people were in the early 2000s, thereabouts. They were complaining about this notion of reconciliation. And they were saying, why we've got control now of the army and the police and so on, why should we reconcile? Why don't we just use our newfound power against the enemy? And then Paulo Jordan stood up and said, no, we don't want to reconcile, but reconciliation is a way to limit the room for maneuver of the enemy. Because obviously, if you present yourself as, with an olive branch and you're a man of peace, you make it very difficult for your opponent to actually show his teeth and start growling at you and coming at you. So in that respect, the ANC has played a double game all along. But this room for maneuver thing, that's propaganda and the information war.
Yeah.
It has to do with that. I think Constant Viljoen also told me once that when he got involved in politics, or when he was head of the army back then, he thought, he told the clerk or somebody, it was going to be 80% politics and 20% maybe military force, or the threat of military force. But in the end, he said it was 100% politics and there was 0% real military confrontation. So I think that was a major error of the old government, that they underestimated the political aspect and the propaganda aspect. I mean, they had all of their people overseas, and they did try in some respects, but they were kind of on the back foot all the time. That they were too much on the defensive as well. They didn't go on the offensive, and I think that's also very necessary for us. We mustn't just kind of defend ourselves from being called white supremacists or racists, or all the entire litany that the left directs at you. We must also really go out to attack them and score some points, some political points against them, because otherwise we're not going to win this battle.
Right. Okay, now let's get on to the next question. I've got a few still here, but I'll do properties first, because everybody's saying, have you seen properties questions? I'm going to post that to you, Dan. Property asks, Scott, can you ask Dan who he thinks is the right leader to lead the whites forward?
Wow. Yeah, good question. Yeah. Well, it's, I don't know. I've spoken to a lot of politicians, but it seems to me that the professional politicians are also at a loss as to how to deal with this situation, because they're earning a salary for shooting their mouths off every now and again in Parliament or at the provincial legislature or municipal gatherings, and they're sort of part of this political machine, and it also they also get socialized into that. So I don't think it's going to come from them. I think it has to. I think it has to be more of a kind of a cultural thing. And I think Steve Hofmeyr, he's achieved quite a lot in that he's shown quite a lot of resistance to the system, and he has been attacked for that, but he's also mobilized a lot of people, and I think given them a bit of courage and so on. So he might not be the ultimate president or leader, but he's already played a major role in kind of waking people up.
Yeah.
And I think we need a lot of that at the moment, just waking people up and giving them confidence and courage to stand up for their rights. I think we need that, because we've been so browbeaten, accused and brainwashed and made to feel guilty, white guilt, and they've directed just so much garbage at us.
Yeah.
That we've got to recover from that, and we've got to take courage and believe in our innocence and our ability to influence the situation and to change it.
Anna has asked, Dan, do you think the Illuminati is busy taking over the human race?
Well, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the thing that worries me a bit is that I've been talking to my son about this as well. And, he's very mathematically inclined and he looks at statistics and that kind of thing. And these big tech companies, they've now got so much control over what we do, and they can watch us, and they've got data on everything we do, what we eat, what we think, what we read on the internet, what we order from online, even buy at the shop, because every time you swipe your credit card, they've got that data as well. So and ultimately, I read a thing about Amazon the other day that they were actually collecting data on where people join unions and where they don't. And they find that where they've got diverse workforces in certain areas, there, or I think it's one of the affiliates, it's not actually Amazon itself, but one of the companies they own, Whole Foods or something like that, that they find that in those places where people are more diverse, there's a lot less resistance to the management, and they can actually manipulate people more easily than in other areas where the workforce is more homogeneous and where there's more of a kind of a camaraderie among the workers. So I think that tells us why these big kind of global companies want diversity, because that way people are sort of isolated and alienated individuals, and then they can start manipulating them with their data and their kind of control over us, and knowing exactly how we behave. And there's even a whole branch of what, combining data with psychology, and where you can, we just becoming, as it were, sort of guinea pigs again, or rats in a laboratory, in this whole kind of high-tech laboratory. I always tell my children that, you don't realize it, but you live in a science fiction world. And, those of us who came from the kind of pre-tech world, where you went to the library to read a book, and you looked up stuff on cards to get information. To them, it's completely incomprehensible.
Yeah.
But we've seen this information revolution, and therefore we understand maybe better all the changes that have taken place, and how we are living in a science fiction world, and it is a kind of an Orwellian world already. All the things predicted by these dystopian authors of the 20th century, like George Orwell and Aldous Huxley and many others, Ray Bradbury, Kurt Vonnegut, some of the science fiction authors. They all predicted this stuff, and it looked very far-fetched, almost.
Yeah.
But we living through that now.
Yeah. Now, Jackie's asked Dan what he knows about Nesara Gesara. Nesara and Gesara. Do you know anything about those?
No, I don't. Sorry, you will have to enlighten me there.
We'll have to Google it later. Gordon?
Yes. Yeah, I'm not an omniscient. It's kind of, yeah, they say, there's a Dunning-Kruger effect. They say that, stupid people think they know everything. because they don't know how much knowledge there is out there.
Yeah.
But if when you start realizing the sort of limits to your knowledge, then that's when you approach kind of wisdom or something. Yes.
Gordon has asked, what about a minority shadow government with some key officials meeting regularly and planning policy strategies?
Yeah.
Has the time come for that?
Yes, I definitely think so. I mean, I've been thinking about that for a long time. And in fact, in the mid-2000s, I had a brilliant thing going like that. We used to meet every month in an historic building, well, in the old Raadsaal in Pretoria, where Paul Kruger and his guys used to rule. And then we did exactly that. But unfortunately, I think it was too early at that time. People didn't really see the need back then, and and eventually there were also some people with political ambitions who wanted to kind of hijack the thing, and then I lost a bit of interest. But I think and now, especially with the technology that we've got at the moment, we don't have to meet physically anymore. We can do it probably online, although it would be nice also to have physical meetings. But yes, we need something like that to take decisions and to also formulate our policy, to say what we think and where we want to go. Because at the moment we're criticizing, these crazy policies imposed on us from above by the ANC and the NGOs and the New World Order and all these foreign countries and powers that don't understand our country and they don't have our interests at heart. But we need to formulate our own policy as well, and where we want to get to and how we are going to get there. And even if people, even if the outside world and the ANC and whoever reject it outright, at least we've got something there. You've got an idea and that we can pursue. And then eventually it might even realize. But we've got to look after ourselves as well, especially under these conditions with the virus and everything. We've got to know as well what's going on, because you can't just. We've got to have some sort of intelligence as well to get. Not in a sort of a covert sense, but we also need to just have enough knowledge as to what the hell's going on in the country, where there are riots and looting and who's being threatened, so that we can respond to that.
Right.
So yeah, I'm definitely in favor of that idea. I mean, it's a huge task, and it's very time consuming to get people together and to
get them to work together,
debate and get them to work together. But it's possible. I think now, maybe for the first time, it's possible, because the crisis is now so big. We've got the health crisis, but we've also got the economic crisis and the security crisis, because we've been at least partially disarmed, and so if there's any form of violence now, we're going to struggle to cope with it, I think.
Right.
And looting and disorder and breakdown of law and order, because that can happen under the current conditions.
And if we don't have that shadow government in place, it's going to be doubly hard to respond to it.
Exactly.
Now,
yes.
just talking about that, we've been going for 2.5 hours, and I really thank you for your time, Dan, but my live streams tend to go for a long time. Now, a lot of people are talking about secession of the Western Cape, breaking a piece of the Western Cape off and using it for the minority groups and basically giving the middle finger to the ANC. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I'll support that, I think. But somehow, I always just wonder why it hasn't happened yet. And whether the people in the Western Cape are so keen on that idea, because to some extent, they've been spared the brunt of the shock that we've had to weather in the north of the country. And only now is it really hitting them, a lot of the change that the ANC has brought in the new system. And maybe they are, I might be mistaken, but they might not be as keen on the idea as people elsewhere in the country would be. And then, of course, we will all of us would have to move down there and create jobs for ourselves. And but it's possible. It's certainly possible. And I also like the Southern Cape. I think I've always kind of fantasized that the Southern Cape even could secede. You've got Mossel Bay there, and as a harbour. It's not a very big harbour, but I think it's number 6 or something. And you've got a lot pristine. You've got a lot of tourism, potential there, and anywhere. You probably know that in Australia, I think there's a list of immigrants or various nationalities. There are about 160 nationalities, and I read somewhere that South Africans are number 1 on that list. We are the most successful immigrants in Australia because we're well educated, well trained. We've got initiative. We've got a good work ethic. So we can do anything. If we weren't held back by the system as we are at the moment, we could achieve anything. We could be a new Switzerland.
Yeah. But
Switzerland, Dan, I think the per capita income is something like $80,000 per person per year.
Yeah. Dan,
yes.
This has just come to me as a bit of a lightning bulb moment. When the ANC falls into disarray, wouldn't one of the most important things for the minority population in South Africa to do is to identify all the NGO advisors to the ANC and have them all locked up so that they can't spread their crap?
Yes, good idea. Yes.
So
we should know who they are.
Yeah,
we should know thy enemy kind of thing. We should know who these people are and who. There are people in this country who are constantly, every day, working against us. They are thinking up these bizarre schemes.
Yeah.
How to prejudice us, how to undermine us. And we don't even know who they are and what they are doing.
Well, can I make a suggestion to you and Praag? Why don't you start a forum or a blog where you research on the people who are actually like this woman with Plus, and you just do a complete expose on them, and you just go through, because there's senior people in largely George Soros's Open Society Foundation, and if we were able to identify who they are with a photo of them and basically say why they are just when the shit hits the fan, it's going to be that much easier to put them behind bars.
True. Yeah, and also what you were talking about, the kind of shadow government idea, because at any moment as we're going in further and further into this crisis, health crisis, economic crisis, there could be riots, breakdown. At some or other point, what we call the government here might also just break down, and then you need something. You need an alternative of people who at least know what they're doing and how the country works, and who could then, at least in the interim, assure some form of stability.
Right.
Because I've got very little faith in this ANC bunch. Unfortunately, they don't make a good impression on me. Honestly.
Now, I'm just going to address those who are watching the live stream now. I am going to be shutting down the live stream probably in the next 5 to 10 minutes. We've been going for close to 3 hours now, and I know that Dan has has been
Yeah,
talking. He
I
must
went
be
to
tired.
in actual fact, I was in another live stream last night with a bunch of people in the USA,
Yeah.
and it went on until midnight. So
Oh, no.
was fairly tired today. So
Yeah, I can
couldn't be
understand
able
that.
to
But
do another midnight session. No.
yeah, no, we're coming to an end of this live stream. Okay, so now there's a very good question. Nikki has said, please share a list of companies on Loving Life Triple B Double E Alert WhatsApp group. Now, what has actually been suggested by people who watch my channel is that when you go into a business, the first question you ask is, are you BEE compliant? This is a white person. If they say yes, you say, okay, fine, I'm not going to do business with you. And then you go until you find someone who is not BEE compliant and say, okay, we're going to support you.
Yeah,
I think that's a hugely important way to go for going forward, because these BEE compliant organizations have sold out on the minority groups. No question about that. Now, Spitfire has asked, Dan, can you design a plan for us? I think going forward for South Africa.
Yeah, I think I could do that. Yes, but I need a few. I'm just a bit short on resources, and time and money and so on. But yeah, it's entirely possible. 100,000 rand can go a long way. Yeah, it's we've got I've got a few debit orders running, or people supporting me and so on. But with the economic crisis, a lot of debit orders are bouncing as well. But we just need to get our kind of financial resources a little bit, get our ducks in a row, and then we could do a lot, because I think there's a real need for more strategic thinking and preparing the country for what comes after the ANC. That's one of the interesting things that I read about this whole Swedish conspiracy against South Africa. Already in 1986, the Swedes were getting the ANC together there in Stockholm, and they were telling them, it's all well, you're fighting this battle and so on, but you've got to start thinking now about when you take over. And they had this acronym, they called it SAPA, South Africa Post-Apartheid. And at that time, Peter Botha and the army, and they were still in control, but they were already talking about South Africa post-apartheid. And we've got to start talking about South Africa post-ANC, SAPANC, We've got to think about what the country will look like once this bunch has fallen away, or just kind of self-destructed, because ultimately I think they will self-destruct, because they are just too corrupt and too and too extremist. They must self-destruct. All these revolutionary regimes all over the world, they always self-destruct. You had Pol Pot in Cambodia, killing people and driving them out of the cities and so on. But his regime only lasted a few years. And in Africa as well, a lot of these kind of were what do you call it, the coup d'etat and so on. And Mozambique under Frelimo and Samora Machel, that didn't last very long, because ultimately they destroyed the country, and then something new, it had to be replaced by something else.
Right.
And this bunch, they're on the verge of taking very radical steps here, especially with this EWC business. And if they do that, they are going to self-destruct, because there won't be food, and the economic consequences will just be so severe that they won't be able to stay in power.
Well, I don't think the Boer folk will let it happen.
Yeah, and exactly. But Smuts also said something that a lot of people have quoted, and he said somewhere that South Africa's future will always be determined outside her borders. Because, we're sort of a minor power in the world, and it's just so easy to kind of undermine us from outside, or impose sanctions on us, or, refuse to roll over our loans, or whatever they want to do from outside. They can influence us very easily. So we've got to play on the international aspect as well, and perhaps, if there is a lot of disorder in South Africa, eventually these foreigners will actually beg us to take over, just to save the country.
Yeah.
So that's why it's also important to be at least talking about alternatives.
Yeah.
And a post-ANC epoch in South Africa.
Right.
Because, this thing cannot last forever. It's just impossible.
Jackie
asked. It could. But
Dan?
It will be very, yes.
Jackie asked, Dan, what do you think of Koeberg's stability? Something that is very troubling.
Yeah, I've also heard here and there that they don't really know what they're doing over there, but one would, that's one of the things that one would have to research a bit, but at least the French who are involved there, and I think they've got some of the maintenance contracts, or they used to have, because it was built according to the French plan. They might still, keep it in good shape, although I'm not 100% sure. So it's something that will have to be looked at, just to make sure that something doesn't go wrong there, and you the next moment we have a kind of a Chernobyl on our hands or something.
Yeah, that would be terrible.
Yes, it would be. Nuclear power can be very useful, but it can also be dangerous if things go wrong.
Right. Now, I've got one final question for you. And I know it's approaching 11 p.m. in South Africa, and we will be off before 11 p.m. Don't worry, Dan. I can see you kind of falling asleep at the wheel there.
Yeah, well, it's...
Okay.
Yeah, I normally wear these little earphones or something, but I hear much better with these. So
well,
kind of...
the setup you got is fantastic. The audio is perfect, and that's the most important thing. Now, Property says, Scott, can you ask Dan what he thinks about Dr. Rashid Butta? And this is the final question I'm going to be putting to you. So he's a guy who's been talking about COVID-19, etc.
Just refresh. I've seen his name mentioned here and there, but I don't think I've actually read his stuff or listened to his speeches about that.
Yeah, what he's...
Just refresh my memory on that one.
What he's suggesting is there is a conspiracy behind the coronavirus, basically.
Oh, okay, fine. Yeah, well, that's a big topic. But I think there's been one Japanese scientist who's also said that it must be a man-made virus. And there are some pretty bizarre things around it, about that laboratory in Wuhan, which was also built by the French, incidentally. And there are kind of worrying things around this whole virus and the way it looks, and certain elements, that DNA that has been inserted into the virus, or that could have been inserted into the virus, and how it got out.
Yeah.
Who knows? Again, it comes down to what I was saying, that we're living in a science fiction world now. We are faced with a global viral pandemic.
Yeah.
Just like in a movie or in a science fiction novel. And we're going to have to cope with that. And we're going to probably have to change our lifestyle quite a lot.
Yeah.
We have already radically changed it, but we've got to get back to some form of normality. But even then, it's not. There's going to be a new normal. It won't be the old normal.
Right. Now, Dan, we have already asked, sorry, not Dan, what am I talking about? Boerevechter. We have already asked Dan a question basically on exactly that subject about when will the ANC implode. So I'll just leave that one out. Dan, just in wrapping up, I once again thank you so much for coming on the channel, talking to us. Your knowledge is fantastic. I mean, you certainly have clear objectives and ideas, and see a way forward for South Africa, especially the minority group, the white population. Would you like to address the people watching this video right now, and also for people who actually come and watch it later on? What's your message to them?
I think my message to them would be that, we are facing huge difficulties at the moment economically, regarding this virus, and all the bad political decisions that have been taken, especially in South Africa over the last 20, 30 years. And that has created this very negative situation in our country. But on the other hand, if you look further back, if you kind of put on your binoculars and look further back and see what we've come through already in South Africa in the 19th century. There were so many wars and massacres and so on in the 19th century, and the country was destroyed by the Anglo-Boer War, burned down in the north completely. And we recovered from that, and for a while there in the 60s, we were on our way to becoming another Australia or another Canada. We would have been an OECD country, and we would have, and we had a very good standard of living nonetheless, despite some of our other problems. So I think we can pull through all of this and come out on the other side and be wiser and, as it were, recover from this kind of a war that we've also been fighting over the lot ever since about 1960. I think that there's been some sort of a covert war against us, and it hasn't entirely ceased yet. But we can overcome it, and we've got such a fantastic piece of real estate here. It's stable, it's geologically stable. We've got the sun, we've got the beaches, we've got the minerals. It's just a paradise. It could be a paradise if only we had some wise people steering us into the future, and not this bunch of hysterical leftists and their crazy ideas.
Well, it's about time the adults in the room stood up and took over the classroom again.
Exactly. Yes, that's what we need. We need a bit, the return of more of a traditional way of doing things, and more respect for authority and law and order. And then South Africa could again become the leading country in Africa.
Yeah.
And you see all our companies doing business all over the continent. We could build an empire here. We could really achieve something great on this continent with all its natural resources, and that we understand so well. I mean, we know what the limitations are here, but we also know what the potential is. So we could, we could become almost another USA if we put our minds to it.
Right.
We could become an even better USA. So I think, if only we can come together and start getting on the same page and have a plan. It's important to have a plan. Without a plan, you just go nowhere. So we've got to get together, make that plan, and then implement it. And then I think we'll be surprised. What's on the other side is not insurmountable.
Right.
I think we've only been brainwashed into thinking it's kind of what they call learned. What do they call it? It's a kind of an acquired inadequacy that you've been taught you can't do it, and then you think you can't.
Right.
And there have been experiments on dogs and so on by American psychologists. You can actually read up on it on the internet if you like. There's a guy called Seligman who did these experiments, but it applies to human beings as well.
Now, Dan.
And once you've been hurt a couple of times trying to do something, then you tend to avoid it.
Yeah.
You just kind of cower in the corner and weep in your little corner. But you've got to get out of that and start doing things and moving forward. And that's what we need.
Yeah. Now, Dan, how can people contact you? I mean, you've got a website,
well, it's
haven't
very
you?
easy. Yeah. I've got a website
Is that
in English
Praag?
and in Afrikaans. It's called praag.co.za. That's the Afrikaans one. And then there's an English one, praag.org. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, where you can very easily contact me.
So guys, if you need to contact Dan, that's how you do it. So praag.co.za, which is the Afrikaans version, or praag.org, and that's Praag.
Yeah, and you can also email me at info@praag.org.
Fantastic. Now,
info@praag.org.
right. Now Properties asked, Scott, please get Steve Hofmeyr on your live stream. Now, Marlena will tell you, we have been trying to get Steve on our live stream for probably a year now. And we got very close when he came to Brisbane. And he performed in Brisbane. And I got an email from Steve Hofmeyr out of the blue at that time. And he said, Scott, can you take your subscribers off me? I feel like I'm being swamped. Yes, I will do a live stream with you. I promise I will do a live stream with you once I'm back in South Africa. And that was a year ago. I gave up trying to get Steve to respond and set something up probably about 8 or 9 months ago. I haven't had any contact with him since. If you want to put in a good word to Steve and just say, look, the opportunity still exists to have a live stream with Scott.
Okay.
Please
Okay,
do.
fine.
Because we have tried. Believe me, we have tried.
Okay.
All right. Guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a fascinating evening. I think that the knowledge that Dan has shared with us has been absolutely extraordinary. And, of course, this live stream will just stay in the archives, so you can always go and have a look at it from woe to go. To the moderators, and to particularly Marlena, who's been pushing the likes. Well done, Marlena. We hit the 300 target. That's fantastic. Thank you guys for doing what you do. For those people who will watch this video later on, please enjoy and remember to subscribe to this channel. We have a whole lot of really, really exciting live streams coming up. And to my guest, to Dan, I just want to say thank you, Dan. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I've watched a lot of your videos, and I've read up a lot about what you do, and I think that you are a very special person.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah. People can also watch our YouTube channel. It's Praag TV. You can just Google Praag TV. It's on YouTube. youtube.com/Praag TV, and you'll find it there.
Great. All right, guys. Look, Dan's just about
excellent. Well, and thank you for the conversation. It's been interesting. Also, all the interesting questions that people have been asking.
Yeah, it's been a great live stream, and I can see that Dan is just about falling asleep in his chair. So I'm gonna shut off the live stream now. Good night, guys. Please take care. Be safe, and we'll catch up tomorrow night. Don't forget, tomorrow night we've got Ian Cameron from AfriForum joining us at 8 p.m. Night, guys.
Okay, great. Thank you. Good night.